You imagine it clearly. A knight in shining armor, mounted on a massive warhorse, lowering his lance as a swarm of peasants scatter before him. Armed with nothing but farm tools, scythes, flails, axes, they should stand no chance. That's the picture we've inherited from centuries of stories and, more recently, from movies and games. Knights as untouchable gods of war, peasants as helpless victims, an easy slaughter. But history tells a different story. Again and again, common militias, ordinary men pulled from fields and villages, stood their ground and brought down the very warriors trained to dominate them. These weren't lucky accidents. They were moments when desperation, clever tactics, and sheer unity overcame steel and nobility. And when it happened, the shockwaves rattled kingdoms. This is the myth versus the reality. The armored knight was powerful, yes, but not invincible. Against organized, determined peasants, even the most elite warriors could be humbled, beaten, and left broken in the mud. So the question isn't whether peasants had a chance, they proved they did. The real question is how men who worked the land could sometimes topple the lords who ruled it. And the answers are more brutal and more surprising than you've ever imagined. For generations, the knight has been portrayed as the ultimate warrior of the medieval world. In films, literature, and even school lessons, knights appear as unstoppable forces, towering in gleaming armor, armed with swords that cut down any foe, trampling over helpless peasants with ease. Popular imagination has turned them into invincible figures, a symbol of martial dominance and aristocratic power. The peasant, in this picture, is reduced to a victim, poorly armed, poorly trained, and destined only to die beneath hooves or steel. This myth grew not only from propaganda, but also from spectacle. Knights wrote the chronicles, poets praised their valor, and nobles celebrated their tournaments. The image of the heroic knight was carefully crafted, reinforced by pageantry and legend. It was comforting to the ruling elite to believe, and to make others believe, that commoners could never rise above their station. Knights, armored and mounted, seemed to embody superiority in every way. But the truth was far more complicated. Armor offered protection, but it was not invulnerable. Swords were iconic, but they were not always the best tools against large groups. Horses gave speed and shock, but terrain could turn that advantage into a liability. And most of all, knights were few in number. Against a well-prepared militia, sheer manpower and coordination could overwhelm even the finest steel. The myth of knightly superiority also ignored a harsh reality. Peasants were not weaklings. They worked the land with their bodies every day, building strength and endurance that no noble's training hall could replicate. When these men banded together, driven not by sport but by survival, the invincible knight suddenly looked much more vulnerable. The legend of the knight was powerful, but history proved the sword was not always stronger than the scythe. To understand why peasants sometimes stood their ground against knights, you have to step into their world. Forget the image of frail, helpless villagers. These were men forged by relentless labor, hardened not in training yards, but in the fields. Every day of their lives was physical conditioning. They plowed, harvested, chopped wood, carried water, built with stone and timber. This constant toil created incredible endurance and raw strength, the kind of fitness modern athletes spend years trying to achieve. A knight trained for combat, yes, but a peasant trained for survival, without ever calling it training. Their tools became their weapons. A flail, used for threshing grain, could crush bone as easily as it struck wheat. A scythe, adapted with a little ironwork, became a vicious polearm capable of cutting through flesh and even slipping past armor joints. Axes, hammers, and clubs, daily implements of work, were repurposed into lethal instruments when militias formed. Peasants didn't fight with elegant swords, but with brutal efficiency. Equally important was their knowledge of terrain. Peasants knew every hill, marsh, and forest path of their homeland. When militias fought, they often chose battlegrounds that favored them and sabotaged knights. Muddy fields slowed cavalry charges, Steep passes, neutralized horses, and narrow roads forced armored men into choke points. A knight's advantage was speed and shock, strip that away, and the playing field suddenly leveled. Then there was psychology. For a knight, battle was duty, glory, or the pursuit of wealth. For a peasant, it was survival. They weren't fighting for banners or honor, they were fighting for homes, families, and futures. That desperation transformed them into fierce, united opponents. When you have nothing left to lose, you fight with a resolve that terrifies even the best-trained warrior. Militias also relied on sheer numbers and cooperation. A lone peasant stood no chance against a mounted knight, but organized groups, standing shoulder to shoulder with pikes or improvised polearms, created walls of resistance that even cavalry feared. A horse charging into a hedge of spears risked death as much as its rider, and once knights were unhorsed, they became vulnerable, surrounded, outnumbered, and dragged into the mud. Life as a peasant was harsh, but that hardship built resilience. They were not helpless fodder. They were a silent army waiting for the right moment, and when called upon, their strength, knowledge, and desperation turned them into a force powerful enough to shake the foundations of medieval power itself. History remembers knights as masters of the battlefield, but the chronicles also preserve moments when common men, peasants, militias, and townsfolk stood their ground and humbled the so-called elite. These weren't accidents. They were turning points where desperation, terrain, and strategy overcame noble steel. Take the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, also known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. The French knights, proud and confident, charged. Into Flemish militias they expected to scatter like sheep, but the ground was soft, riddled with ditches and streams. Horses stumbled, momentum broke, and suddenly the armoured cavalry found themselves bogged down in mud. The Flemish, armed with pikes and gutting hooks, dragged knights from their saddles and slaughtered them. Over 1,000 knights fell that day, their gilded spurs collected as trophies. What was meant to be an easy massacre turned into a humiliating defeat for France's finest. Just over a decade later, in 1315 at Morgarten, Swiss peasants faced the might of the Habsburg army. The knights advanced confidently through a narrow, mountain pass, armoured cavalry at the front. But the peasants knew their land. From the slopes above, they unleashed an avalanche of boulders, logs, and arrows. The charge disintegrated in chaos as knights and horses crashed into each other. Then the peasants surged with halberds and clubs, cutting down enemies who couldn't maneuver in the cramped terrain. What began as a march of conquest ended in disaster, establishing the Swiss reputation as fearless defenders. Another lesson came from England's longbowmen at Crécy, 1346, and Agincourt, 1415. These weren't professional knights, but common soldiers wielding a weapon that turned the battlefield upside down. At Agincourt, French knights charged across mud under a hail of arrows. Horses collapsed, men slipped, and armoured nobles became trapped in heaps, suffocating beneath each other's weight. English archers, many of them peasants, rushed forward with mallets and knives to finish the helpless elites. It wasn't glamorous, it was slaughter. A handful of commoners with bows had humbled the most prestigious cavalry in Europe. In urban centres, militias also proved deadly. During uprisings in Flanders and northern Italy, townsfolk armed with crossbows, pikes, and improvised weapons overwhelmed knightly garrisons. Their strength lay not in individual skill, but in organisation and unity. Behind barricades, in narrow streets, or on fortified walls, the advantages of knights vanished. A sword was useless against boiling oil, stones hurled from rooftops, or a wall of spears guarding an alley. These case studies reveal a consistent pattern. Knights thrived in open fields with room for cavalry charges and duels. But when peasants chose the battlefield, muddy marshes, mountain passes, narrow roads, or fortified towns, the knight's superiority crumbled. Numbers, terrain, and ingenuity shifted the balance. Each of these victories sent shockwaves through medieval society. They reminded nobles that their dominance was not guaranteed, and that even common men could rise, if united, to bring down armoured lords. The myth of the invincible knight was cracked not in theory, but in blood and mud. When knights and peasants met on the battlefield, the clash wasn't just physical, it was psychological. A knight carried the weight of prestige, training, and confidence. From birth, he was told he was superior, destined to rule through war. His armour and weapons reinforced that belief. Facing untrained farmers should have been no more than a chore. That mindset gave him courage, but it also bred arrogance, and arrogance could be fatal. For peasants, the stakes were different. They weren't fighting for glory or reputation. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. Fear weighed heavily on them, but fear can transform into ferocity when survival is the only option. A peasant with nothing to lose could strike with a desperation no knight could match. And when hundreds of them stood together, that desperation multiplied into something terrifying, a wall of defiance sharpened by rage. This clash of mindsets often determined outcomes. Knights believed their armour made them untouchable, but peasants exploited weaknesses with cunning. Where knights hesitated, expecting honour, peasants ambushed. Where knights sought duels, peasants fought as a swarm. The psychological edge shifted when nobles realised they weren't facing victims, but survivors willing to kill without restraint. In that moment, the myth of superiority shattered, not because steel broke, but because certainty did. The reality of medieval warfare is far more nuanced than movies suggest. Knights were formidable, their training and armour giving them a terrifying edge in most situations. Yet, history repeatedly shows that numbers, strategy, and sheer determination could tip the scales. Peasant militias, armed with farm tools, makeshift weapons, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain, were far from helpless. They exploited weaknesses, ambushed with precision, and fought with a desperation born of necessity. This isn't a tale of evenly matched duels or cinematic heroics. It's a story of survival, ingenuity, and the unpredictable nature of combat. The psychological clash mattered as much as the physical one. A confident knight could falter against a crowd that refused to yield, while fear and unity empowered ordinary men to perform extraordinary feats. So, what does this mean for us today? It challenges our assumptions about power, skill, and historical narratives. It begs the question, if you were a peasant facing a knight, could you survive? Could courage, cunning, and collective will overcome the blade? History leaves the answer uncertain, but the lesson is clear. Never underestimate the underestimated.